Few things crush an NFL fan's spirit more than a bad trade. One wrong move can derail a franchise for years. Just ask the Texans after they traded away one of their greatest players. But that's just the beginning. In this video, we're counting down the 20 worst trades in NFL history. From draft busts to superstars swapped for next to nothing, these deals left fans shaking their heads. And trust me, by the time we reveal the final trade, you'll be wondering, how did anyone think this was a good idea? Let's dive in. Let's kick things off with a trade that's still fresh and stings for 49ers fans, Trey Lance. Back in 2021, the San Francisco 49ers made a bold, and I mean bold, move by trading 3 first-round picks and a third-round pick to move up in the draft and snag Lance as their franchise quarterback. With that kind of investment, you'd expect them to have landed the next Joe Montana, right? Spoiler alert, not even close. Lance was supposed to be the guy to take the 49ers into the future, but instead, he became the poster child for high-risk, high-reward trades that don't quite pay off. Injuries were a constant hurdle for Lance, sidelining him for most of his rookie season, and when he did hit the field, his performance was, well, let's just say it wasn't worth 3 first-rounders. By the time the 49ers moved on, they were left with Trey Lance-shaped hole in their future plans, and Jimmy Garoppolo's return didn't exactly solve everything either. Fast forward to 2023, and the 49ers decided they'd seen enough. They shipped Lance off to the Dallas Cowboys for a 4th-round pick. Yes, you heard that right. The guy they traded their future for was now worth less than a bag of footballs. Meanwhile, the Cowboys are crossing their fingers, hoping Lance can somehow revive his career in Dallas. It's a tough pill to swallow for San Francisco, considering what they could have done with those 3 first-round picks. Imagine if they had picked up players like Micah Parsons or Ja'Marr Chase. Ouch, that's gotta hurt. Instead, they bet big on a player who just couldn't deliver. This trade is a perfect example of how even the most promising prospects can crash and burn under the weight of expectations and bad luck. The 49ers could have flipped a coin and gotten a better outcome. But hey, that's the NFL for you. Sometimes you win, sometimes you lose big, and in this case, they lost really big. Let's move on to a trade that had Minnesota Vikings fans shaking their heads in disbelief, the Sam Bradford deal. It was 2016, and the Vikings were in a serious bind. Just days before the season, their young franchise quarterback, Teddy Bridgewater, suffered a catastrophic knee injury that left their entire season hanging by a thread. With no viable option at quarterback, the Vikings made a desperate call to the Philadelphia Eagles, offering a 1st-round pick and a 4th-rounder for Bradford. Now, here's the thing about Sam Bradford, he was the ultimate what-if quarterback. Drafted 1st overall in 2010, Bradford had all the tools to be a superstar, but injuries and inconsistency kept him from ever reaching his full potential. So, when the Vikings made this trade, many were skeptical. Could Bradford really lead Minnesota to the promised land, or was this just another chapter in his injury-riddled career? Initially, it looked like the Vikings had pulled off a miracle. Bradford came in, learned the playbook in record time, and helped the team win their first 5 games. The Vikings were off to a blazing start, and fans were cautiously optimistic. Maybe, just maybe, Bradford was the answer. But like a well-written twist in a tragic novel, the honeymoon period didn't last long. As the season wore on, the cracks began to show. Bradford's infamous inability to stay healthy reared its head again, and his play became increasingly erratic. The offensive line couldn't protect him, and as Bradford took hit after hit, the Vikings' hopes for a deep playoff run crumbled. By the end of the season, it was clear that Bradford wasn't going to be the long-term solution the Vikings had hoped for. Meanwhile, the Eagles were sitting pretty. They used the 1st-round pick from the Vikings to continue building a contender, and just a year later, they hoisted the Lombardi Trophy after one of the most thrilling Super Bowls in NFL history. Bradford, meanwhile, was off to Arizona, having played only 1 full season in Minnesota and leaving behind nothing but a string of unmet expectations. For Vikings fans, the Sam Bradford trade became a cautionary tale about desperation. When you make a move out of panic, you often pay the price. Minnesota's decision to part with a 1st-round pick for a quarterback with a well-documented injury history left them in a hole, while the Eagles turned their misfortune into a championship. It's hard to imagine a more lopsided outcome. Now let's talk about a trade that had Dallas Cowboys fans asking, wait, which Roy Williams did we just trade for? Back in 2008, the Cowboys were convinced they had found their next star wide receiver and decided to go all in on Roy Williams. In exchange for him, they sent the Detroit Lions a hefty package, a 1st-round pick, a 3rd-round pick, and a 6th-round pick. That's right, 3 valuable draft picks for one player. At first glance, it seemed like a solid move. Roy Williams had shown flashes of brilliance during his time with the Lions, and the Cowboys were hungry to give Tony Romo another weapon. But what they didn't realize is that Williams' best days were already behind him. As soon as he put on that Cowboys jersey, it became painfully clear that he wasn't going to be the dominant wide receiver Dallas had hoped for. Williams struggled to make an impact on the field. His hands, which were once reliable, suddenly seemed to turn into stone. Dropped passes, miscommunications, and a lack of chemistry with Romo became the norm. In fact, during his entire stint with the Cowboys, Williams never came close to replicating the production he had in Detroit. Cowboys fans couldn't help but wonder if they had accidentally traded for the wrong Roy Williams. Meanwhile, the Lions were laughing all the way to the draft board. They used the Cowboys' first-round pick to select key players for their rebuilding process, while Dallas was left to wonder what they had just thrown away. As for the Cowboys, they were left without draft capital and without the wide receiver production they desperately needed. Talk about a double whammy. In the end, Roy Williams became the textbook example of a team overvaluing a player based on past potential rather than current reality. The Cowboys had taken a massive gamble, and it didn't pay off at all. Williams was eventually released, and the Cowboys were left with nothing but regret and a big hole where their future draft picks should have been. This trade is a classic case of how franchises sometimes make blind bets on players who are past their prime, hoping for a revival that just never comes. As Cowboys fans quickly learned, not every deal works out, especially when you mistake a name for greatness. Jay Cutler, the quarterback with an arm like a cannon and an attitude like someone who just lost their keys. Back in 2009, the Chicago Bears were so desperate for a franchise quarterback that they traded away their future to acquire him from the Denver Broncos. And when I say their future, I mean it. The Bears gave up 2 first-round picks, a third-round pick, and quarterback Kyle Orton in exchange for Cutler. That's a hefty price tag for a guy who looked like he'd rather be anywhere but on a football field most Sundays. On paper, it seemed like a good deal. Cutler had just made the Pro Bowl and had all the physical tools a team could want in a quarterback. The Bears were convinced that he was the missing piece to their offensive puzzle, a guy who could finally lead them back to the Super Bowl. What could go wrong? Well, as it turns out, a lot. Cutler's time in Chicago was a roller coaster of incredible throws followed by head-scratching interceptions. One minute, he'd thread the needle between defenders, and the next, he'd be tossing the ball directly into the hands of the opposing team. His inconsistent play drove Bears fans crazy, but what really stuck with them was his body language. Cutler had a perpetual look of indifference, which didn't exactly inspire confidence in the locker room or in the stands. His sideline demeanor became so infamous that it spawned countless memes of his signature expression, one of permanent disinterest. Meanwhile, over in Denver, the Broncos used the picks from the Bears to kickstart a rebuild. They eventually turned that draft capital into players who would help them reach new heights, including a certain Peyton Manning who would lead them to 2 Super Bowls, winning one. Chicago, on the other hand, spent the next 8 years watching Cutler sling passes and grimace on the sidelines. In the end, Jay Cutler never delivered the success the Bears were hoping for. He set franchise records in passing yards and touchdowns, sure, but Chicago paid a steep price for a quarterback who never quite got them over the hump. And let's be honest, when fans look back at Cutler's time with the Bears, they probably remember his eternally disappointed expression more than anything else. Chicago gambled big on Cutler, but all they really got was a quarterback who looked as frustrated as the fans watching him. Next up, we've got the Carson Wentz saga, one that had Indianapolis Colts fans feeling like they'd been sold a shiny sports car, only to find out it had a faulty engine. In 2021, the Colts decided to roll the dice and trade for Wentz, sending the Philadelphia Eagles a 3rd-round pick and a conditional 1st-round pick that eventually became a 1st-rounder after Wentz met the playing time conditions. On paper, it seemed like a solid move. The Colts were getting a former MVP candidate who had already shown he could lead a team deep into the playoffs, before injuries derailed his season. But here's the thing about Wentz: when he's good, he's great, but when he's bad, he's really bad. And unfortunately for the Colts, they got a lot more of the latter during his short-lived tenure in Indianapolis. Right from the start, things didn't feel quite right. Wentz suffered a foot injury during training camp that required surgery, forcing him to miss valuable preparation time with his new team. Still, when he did hit the field, there was hope that he could bounce back. For a while, it looked like Wentz might turn things around. He had some solid games early on, but as the season progressed, the inconsistencies and questionable decision-making that had plagued his time in Philadelphia reappeared. By the end of the season, it was clear that Wentz wasn't going to be the franchise savior the Colts had hoped for. His performance in the final 2 games, in which Indianapolis only needed 1 win to make the playoffs but lost both, was the final nail in the coffin. Those games were especially brutal, including a stunning loss to the Jacksonville Jaguars that effectively ended their postseason hopes. In the end, Wentz lasted just one season in Indianapolis before the Colts decided to cut their losses and trade him to the Washington Commanders. It was a whirlwind for Colts fans, who had expected a return to playoff glory but instead got a season of heartache and frustration. They had traded a valuable first-round pick for a quarterback who couldn't even last more than a year. It's safe to say the Wentz experiment didn't pan out the way anyone in Indianapolis had envisioned. The Colts bet big, but all they got in return was a fleeting season of mediocrity. For a team that had high hopes, this trade ended up being one they'd rather forget. The Mitch Trubisky trade, a move that still has Chicago Bears fans collectively sighing. In the 2017 NFL Draft, the Bears made a head-scratching decision that would haunt them for years. They traded up one spot from the 3rd overall pick to the 2nd, giving up multiple draft picks in the process, to select Mitch Trubisky as their franchise quarterback. Sounds like a solid investment, right? Well, not when you realize that they passed up Patrick Mahomes, who was taken just 8 picks later by the Kansas City Chiefs. Trubisky was seen as a promising talent, but he was far from a sure thing coming out of college. Meanwhile, Mahomes was regarded as having an incredibly high ceiling but needed some development. However, as history would soon show, it was the Bears who were in need of development, mainly in their decision-making skills. As the years went by, it became painfully clear that Chicago had made a monumental mistake. Trubisky had moments of competence and even led the Bears to the playoffs in 2018, but he never developed into the elite quarterback the team hoped for. His accuracy was inconsistent, his decision-making questionable, and his ability to lead the offense sputtered more often than not. Bears fans watched in agony as Trubisky struggled, knowing they could have had Mahomes, who was busy winning MVP awards and leading the Chiefs to Super Bowl victories. The most painful part? The Bears didn't need to trade up in the first place. They gave away a 3rd-round pick, a 4th-round pick, and a future 3rd-round pick just to move up one spot. It's the NFL draft equivalent of paying extra for expedited shipping only to realize the package was already being delivered the next day. If the Bears had simply stayed put, they could have drafted a future Hall of Famer or, at the very least, saved those valuable picks. Looking back, it's hard not to imagine a world where the Bears could have had Mahomes slinging passes at Soldier Field, potentially leading them to multiple Super Bowl appearances. Instead, they got Trubisky, who has since moved on to other teams, while Chicago is still searching for its long-awaited franchise quarterback. If only someone could have whispered, maybe not, into the Bears' war room that day. It's a decision that will go down as one of the biggest what-ifs in NFL history. Let's take a look at a trade that still has San Francisco 49ers fans wondering what could have been: the decision to part ways with DeForest Buckner, one of the most dominant defensive tackles in the NFL. In 2020, the 49ers sent Buckner packing to the Indianapolis Colts in exchange for a first-round pick, the 13th overall. On paper, it seemed like a solid business move: trade one player for the chance to grab a young, cheaper replacement in the draft. But sometimes, you don't realize how important someone is until they're gone. Buckner was an absolute force in the trenches for the 49ers. A key part of their Super Bowl run in 2019, he was the kind of player who could take over a game, collapsing the pocket and wreaking havoc on opposing offenses. His presence on the defensive line made life easier for everyone around him. So, when the 49ers decided to trade him to the Colts, it raised a few eyebrows. Sure, San Francisco used that first-round pick to draft Javon Kinlaw, a promising defensive tackle out of South Carolina. But Kinlaw, while talented, hasn't been able to replicate Buckner's impact on the field. Injuries have slowed his development, and the 49ers' once dominant defensive line hasn't been the same since. Meanwhile, over in Indianapolis, Buckner picked up right where he left off, dominating offensive lines and earning All-Pro honors as the anchor of the Colts' defense. The Colts knew exactly what they were getting in Buckner, and they didn't hesitate to lock him up with a massive contract extension. For Indianapolis, the trade was a home run. They added a proven, elite talent in the prime of his career to their defense, while the 49ers were left hoping their gamble on Kinlaw would pay off. As it stands, the 49ers defense still has its moments, but they've struggled to replace the consistent pressure and leadership that Buckner brought to the field. It's one of those trades where the immediate return for San Francisco, a promising rookie, hasn't yet come close to matching the production they lost. For Colts fans, it's been nothing but good news, as Buckner continues to wreak havoc on opposing offenses, proving that sometimes it's worth trading draft picks for a proven commodity. In the end, the 49ers rolled the dice by trading a defensive monster for an uncertain future, and as of now, that future hasn't looked nearly as bright as they hoped. Next up, we have the Matt Cassel trade proof that sometimes being a solid backup quarterback doesn't quite translate to being a franchise savior. Let's rewind to 2008 when Tom Brady tore his ACL in the first game of the season, and suddenly, the New England Patriots had to rely on their backup, Matt Cassel. To everyone's surprise, Cassel led the Patriots to an impressive 11-5 record, narrowly missing the playoffs. His success as a fill-in caught the attention of teams around the league, especially the Kansas City Chiefs, who were desperate for a quarterback. In 2009, the Chiefs made their move, trading a second-round pick to the Patriots to acquire Cassel, hoping he'd be the answer to their quarterback woes. Along with Cassel, the Chiefs also received linebacker Mike Vrabel a nice throw-in, but the focus was on Cassel. Kansas City thought they'd found their new franchise quarterback, a guy who could lead them to playoff contention. But what they got was something far less exciting. Cassel's tenure in Kansas City was, to put it bluntly, mediocre at best. Sure, he had one solid season in 2010 when he threw for 27 touchdowns and led the Chiefs to an AFC West title, but outside of that, his time in Kansas City was defined by inconsistency, injuries, and subpar play. Cassel struggled with accuracy and decision-making, often leaving Chiefs fans frustrated as they watched the offense sputter. While Cassel may have been a serviceable backup for the Patriots, he was never quite able to take the reins as a full-time starter in Kansas City. The Chiefs hoped for a game-changer but instead got a quarterback who was, at best, a placeholder, someone who could keep the ship afloat but never elevate the team to greatness. And in the cutthroat world of the NFL, mediocrity just doesn't cut it. Meanwhile, the Patriots used that second-round pick to continue building their dynasty, and Tom Brady returned to lead them to even more Super Bowl glory. As for Cassel, he became more famous for his stint as Brady's backup than for anything he accomplished in Kansas City. It's safe to say that the Chiefs' gamble on Cassel didn't quite pan out as they had hoped. In the end, Matt Cassel was a perfect plan B when you needed someone to step in for an injured star. But as Kansas City learned the hard way, he wasn't the plan A they desperately needed. Now, let's dive into one of the most lopsided trades in NFL history, Randy Moss being traded from the Oakland Raiders to the New England Patriots for, wait for it, a fourth-round pick. Yes, that's right, the Raiders gave away one of the most talented wide receivers of all time for what amounted to pocket change. And if you're wondering how that worked out for them, spoiler alert, it didn't. At the time, Moss was coming off a couple of underwhelming seasons in Oakland. The Raiders were a mess on offense, and Moss seemed disinterested, with his production dropping off significantly. Oakland figured Moss was past his prime and decided to cut their losses, shipping him off to New England for a late-round draft pick. For the Patriots, it was a low-risk, high-reward move. If Moss had anything left in the tank, they'd find out soon enough. As it turns out, Moss had plenty left. In his very first season with the Patriots, Moss didn't just bounce back, he exploded onto the scene, catching an NFL record 23 touchdown passes from Tom Brady as the Patriots went undefeated in the regular season. Moss and Brady formed one of the most lethal duos the league had ever seen, and the Patriots were suddenly the most feared team in football. Meanwhile, the Raiders? They were left watching from the sidelines as Moss reminded everyone why he was a future Hall of Famer. Oakland's offense continued to struggle, and the decision to trade Moss for so little became a symbol of the team's dysfunction during that era. It's hard to imagine what they were thinking. If they had held on to Moss and tried to rebuild around him, who knows how different things could have been. It's almost laughable to think that a player as talented as Randy Moss was traded for a fourth-round pick, especially when you consider what he accomplished in New England. Moss went on to have one of the best seasons of his career, while the Raiders, well, they were the Raiders lost in a sea of bad decisions and missed opportunities. If Oakland had known what Moss was about to do in New England, they might have demanded a little more than just a fourth-rounder. But as it stands, this trade will go down as one of the biggest steals in NFL history and one of the Raiders' most regrettable moves. Trent Richardson, a name that still makes Indianapolis Colts fans cringe. In 2013, the Colts were looking for a spark in their offense, and they believed they had found it in Richardson. They sent a first-round pick to the Cleveland Browns, thinking they were getting a franchise-changing running back. After all, Richardson had been the third overall pick just the year before and had shown flashes of brilliance in his rookie season. What could go wrong? Well, as it turns out, just about everything. Richardson arrived in Indianapolis with sky-high expectations. The Colts hoped he would be the final piece to complement their emerging star quarterback Andrew Luck, giving them the balance they needed to make a deep playoff run. But from the moment Richardson hit the field in a Colts uniform, it became clear that things weren't going according to plan. His vision as a running back was questionable at best. Richardson had a frustrating habit of running into his offensive linemen or missing open lanes completely. Colts fans watched in disbelief as their shiny new toy, acquired at such a high cost, struggled to gain even a few yards per carry. For every one of Richardson's signature power runs, there were a dozen plays where he went absolutely nowhere. Meanwhile, the Browns couldn't believe their luck. They had managed to offload a player who hadn't lived up to his potential in exchange for a valuable first-round pick. Cleveland would use that pick to continue their rebuild, while Indianapolis was stuck with a running back who never lived up to the hype. By the time Richardson's stint in Indianapolis came to an end, he had rushed for a measly 3.1 yards per carry, and his role on the team had diminished significantly. He was eventually cut and bounced around the league before fading into obscurity. The Colts, who had hoped Richardson would become a star, were left holding the bag, with nothing to show for their first-round investment. In theory, the trade made sense. Richardson had all the physical tools to be an elite running back. But in practice, well, he was everything but what the Colts had hoped for. It's safe to say this trade did more harm than good for Indianapolis, setting their offense back and leaving fans wondering what could have been if they had just kept that first-round pick. Sometimes, trades look bad in hindsight, and then there's the Jerome Bettis trade, where the Los Angeles Rams essentially gave away a Hall of Famer for the equivalent of loose change. In 1996, the Rams decided to trade Bettis, their power running back who had been struggling to fit into their new offense. In return, they received a second-round pick and a fourth-round pick from the Pittsburgh Steelers, a move that would go down as one of the worst decisions in franchise history. At the time, the Rams were shifting to a more pass-heavy offense, and Bettis, who thrived as a downhill runner, didn't seem to fit into their plans. So, they sent him packing to Pittsburgh, thinking they could easily replace his production. But what they failed to realize was that they were trading away a generational talent, a player who would go on to earn the nickname the Bus for his ability to carry defenders on his back and grind out tough yards. Once Bettis arrived in Pittsburgh, he was an instant success. In his first season with the Steelers, he rushed for over 1,400 yards and became the heart and soul of their offense. Bettis wasn't just good, he was dominant. His bruising running style was a perfect fit for the Steelers' hard-nosed approach, and over the next decade, Bettis would establish himself as one of the best running backs in NFL history, eventually earning a spot in the Hall of Fame. Meanwhile, the Rams struggled to find any consistency in their running game. The picks they received in the trade didn't come close to matching Bettis' production, and they were left watching from afar as their former star powered the Steelers to the playoffs year after year. It's safe to say the Rams would have loved a do-over on that deal. Trading away Jerome Bettis is like selling a Ferrari and getting a used bicycle in return. Pittsburgh knew exactly what they were getting, while the Rams severely underestimated the value of their star. Bettis went on to become a Pittsburgh legend, cementing his legacy as one of the all-time greats, while the Rams? They were left wondering how they let the bus leave the station. This trade was a textbook case of a franchise misjudging a player's value, and the Steelers cashed in big time. Now, let's talk about one of the most famous quarterback trades in NFL history, John Elway. In 1983, the Baltimore Colts had the #1 overall pick in the draft and used it to select Elway, a highly touted quarterback out of Stanford. There was just one problem: Elway didn't want to play for the Colts. He made it clear that he would refuse to sign with the team and even threatened to pursue a career in Major League Baseball if they didn't trade him. The Colts were left with little choice. Despite having one of the greatest quarterback prospects of all time in their hands, they had to send him packing. After weeks of negotiations, Elway was traded to the Denver Broncos for quarterback Mark Herman, offensive lineman Chris Hinton, and a first-round pick. It was a trade that would change the course of NFL history. Once in Denver, Elway quickly became the franchise quarterback the Broncos had been searching for. Over the next 16 seasons, he led Denver to 5 Super Bowl appearances, winning 2 of them in back-to-back fashion to close out his career. Elway's combination of arm strength, athleticism, and leadership made him one of the most feared quarterbacks in the league, and he cemented his legacy as one of the all-time greats. Meanwhile, the Colts? Well, let's just say things didn't go as well for them. After trading away Elway, they spent years searching for a franchise quarterback, enduring mediocrity and quarterback carousel after quarterback carousel. It wasn't until 1998, when they drafted Peyton Manning, that they finally found a replacement worthy of Elway's caliber. For Colts fans, it's a painful memory. They had John Elway and let him slip through their fingers. Imagine having a Hall of Fame quarterback and being forced to trade him before he ever played a down for your team. That's the reality the Colts faced, and it set them back for over a decade. As for Elway, the trade worked out just fine. He became a legend in Denver, and the Broncos enjoyed years of success. But for the Colts, it was a hard lesson in the importance of keeping your stars happy even when they tell you they'd rather be playing baseball. let's take a look at one of the most infamous trades in NFL history, the day the Atlanta Falcons decided to part ways with Brett Favre, a quarterback who would go on to become a Hall of Famer and a Green Bay Packers legend. In 1992, after just one season with the Falcons, where Favre threw exactly 4 passes, 2 of which were interceptions, Atlanta decided they'd seen enough. They traded Favre to the Green Bay Packers for a first-round pick. Little did they know, this trade would come back to haunt them for decades. At the time, the Falcons didn't view Favre as anything special. He was raw, wild, and seemed more interested in partying than playing. So, they shipped him off to Green Bay, where head coach Mike Holmgren and general manager Ron Wolf saw untapped potential. Boy, were they right. In Green Bay, Favre blossomed into one of the most iconic quarterbacks in NFL history. He became known for his gunslinger mentality, able to make impossible throws and lead miraculous comebacks. Over the next 16 seasons with the Packers, Favre won 3 MVP awards, led Green Bay to 2 Super Bowl appearances, and secured a Super Bowl victory in 1997. His fiery style of play and relentless passion for the game made him a fan favorite and a cornerstone of Packers football. Meanwhile, the Falcons were left watching from the sidelines as Favre built his Hall of Fame career. The first-round pick they received for him? It didn't exactly pan out, and the Falcons spent years cycling through quarterbacks, never quite finding that magic they'd let slip away with Favre. Looking back, it's hard to imagine how the Falcons didn't see what Favre would become. Sure, he was rough around the edges in Atlanta, but the talent was there. Unfortunately for them, it took a move to Green Bay for Favre to realize his full potential. And for the Packers, well, they couldn't have asked for a better trade. Favre brought them success, accolades, and a new era of Packers dominance. As for the Falcons, they've had to live with the reality of trading away one of the greatest quarterbacks of all time. It's a trade that will forever be remembered as a monumental misstep in NFL history. Next up, we have the tale of Steve Young, a quarterback who was once written off by the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, only to become an NFL legend with the San Francisco 49ers. In 1987, the Buccaneers decided to trade Young to the 49ers for a second-round pick and a fourth-round pick. At the time, Tampa Bay was convinced that Young wasn't the answer to their quarterback problems after 2 tough seasons where he struggled mightily. Little did they know, they were about to give up one of the greatest players the game has ever seen. When Young first landed in San Francisco, he was expected to sit behind the legendary Joe Montana. Many thought Young would be a solid backup, but not much more. After all, he had shown little during his time in Tampa to suggest otherwise. But the 49ers, always forward-thinking, saw something special in Young. They knew he had talent, he just needed the right system and some time to develop. As history shows, that's exactly what happened. When Montana's career in San Francisco came to an end due to injuries, Young stepped into the starting role and never looked back. He became the perfect successor to Montana, leading the 49ers to the Super Bowl and winning 2 MVP awards in the process. His dual threat abilities, both passing and running, redefined what a quarterback could do, and he led San Francisco to a Super Bowl victory in 1994, earning Super Bowl MVP honors along the way. Meanwhile, the Buccaneers were left wondering what could have been. The picks they received in the trade didn't yield anything close to what they had given up, and Tampa Bay spent years cycling through quarterbacks, missing out on the kind of stability and success that Young would go on to bring to San Francisco. It's a story of a franchise failing to recognize the true potential of a player simply because of a rough start. Tampa Bay became the place where Young's career nearly died, only for it to be resurrected in San Francisco. It's almost comical to think that the Buccaneers, in their impatience, let go of a future Hall of Famer for so little. As the saying goes, one man's trash is another man's treasure, and for the 49ers, Steve Young became one of their greatest treasures. In the end, Young went from being underestimated in Tampa Bay to becoming a legend in San Francisco, and the Buccaneers became the team that traded away a quarterback who would go on to redefine the position. The DeAndre Hopkins trade, a move that still has Houston Texans fans scratching their heads in disbelief. In 2020, the Texans decided to trade one of the best wide receivers in the league to the Arizona Cardinals in exchange for running back David Johnson, a second-round pick, and a fourth-round pick. On paper, it seemed like the Texans were getting a solid player in Johnson and some draft capital, but in reality, they were about to commit one of the most lopsided trades in recent NFL history. Hopkins had been the heart and soul of the Texans' offense for years. His chemistry with quarterback Deshaun Watson was electric, forming one of the most dangerous quarterback-wide receiver duos in the league. Hopkins had been consistently putting up monster numbers, and his ability to make impossible catches in traffic was second to none. So, when the news broke that the Texans were trading him, fans were understandably furious. How do you trade a player of Hopkins' caliber, especially when the return was, well, underwhelming to say the least? David Johnson, once one of the top running backs in the league, hadn't been the same since suffering multiple injuries, and his performance had significantly declined. The Texans, however, believed they could revive his career and get the old David Johnson back. Spoiler alert, that didn't happen. Johnson struggled to regain his form, and his production was a shadow of what it had been in his prime. Meanwhile, the Texans' offense crumbled without their star receiver, and the once promising connection between Watson and Hopkins was no more. On the other hand, Hopkins wasted no time making an impact in Arizona. In his very first season with the Cardinals, he racked up over 1,400 yards and made highlight reel catches, including the iconic Hail Mary reception against the Buffalo Bills. Hopkins quickly became Kyler Murray's favorite target and solidified himself as one of the best receivers in the league, just as he had done in Houston. For Texans fans, this trade will forever be a sore spot. Losing a player like Hopkins, who still had plenty of gas left in the tank, for an injury-prone running back and some draft picks that haven't panned out, felt like a punch to the gut. It's one of those moves that's hard to justify, even years later. As the saying goes, hindsight is 20/20, but this trade was a head-scratcher from the start. Houston didn't just lose a receiver, they lost a franchise cornerstone, and that's a loss that will linger for years to come. Let's talk about one of the most audacious trades in NFL history, the day the New Orleans Saints went all in on Ricky Williams. In 1999, head coach Mike Ditka decided that the star running back from the University of Texas was the missing piece to take the Saints to the next level. So, in a move that left everyone stunned, the Saints traded away all of their picks in the 1999 draft, along with a first-round and third-round pick in the 2000 draft, just to move up to the 5th overall spot and select Williams. Yes, you heard that right, the Saints gave up their entire draft for one player. It was an unprecedented move, and the pressure on Williams to deliver was immense. In theory, the idea was simple: Ricky Williams was expected to become a generational talent, the type of running back who could carry the franchise on his shoulders. After all, running backs like Barry Sanders had done it before, so why not Williams? Unfortunately for the Saints, things didn't go according to plan. Williams' time in New Orleans was filled with injuries, inconsistency, and off-field distractions. While he showed flashes of brilliance, he never quite lived up to the sky-high expectations placed on him after the trade. Instead of becoming the savior of the franchise, Williams' stint with the Saints was marred by disappointment, and by 2002, he was traded to the Miami Dolphins, leaving New Orleans with little to show for their massive investment. The impact of the trade was devastating for the Saints. Without any draft capital to build around Williams, the team struggled to fill other critical roster needs and fell into mediocrity. Ditka, who had staked his reputation on Williams, was fired after the 1999 season, and the Saints were left to pick up the pieces of a failed experiment that set the franchise back for years. Looking back, it's easy to see why this trade is remembered as one of the biggest blunders in NFL history. When you trade everything for one player, that player has to deliver in a big way. In this case, Williams didn't, and the Saints paid the price. As the saying goes, go big or go home. In this case, Mike Ditka went big, but unfortunately for the Saints, they ended up going home empty-handed. Let's dive into one of the most infamous trades in NFL history, the Herschel Walker trade, also known as the Great Train Robbery. In 1989, the Minnesota Vikings believed they were just one piece away from becoming a Super Bowl contender. That piece, in their minds, was Herschel Walker, a star running back with the Dallas Cowboys who had shown flashes of brilliance. So, in a blockbuster deal, the Vikings traded 3 players and an eye-popping 5 draft picks to the Cowboys for Walker, thinking he would be the key to their Super Bowl aspirations. On paper, the trade seemed like a game-changer. Walker had been a dynamic player in Dallas, and the Vikings were desperate to add a player who could elevate their offense. However, once Walker arrived in Minnesota, things didn't go as planned. He never quite lived up to the hype, struggling to fit into the Vikings system and failing to deliver the kind of impact the team had hoped for. Instead of leading them to a Super Bowl, Walker became a symbol of unmet expectations. Meanwhile, over in Dallas, head coach Jimmy Johnson and the Cowboys were quietly plotting their dynasty. The key to the trade wasn't just the players the Vikings gave up, but the draft picks. The Cowboys used those picks to stockpile talent, eventually drafting key players like Emmitt Smith, Darren Woodson, and Russell Maryland, all of whom would play crucial roles in Dallas' dominance throughout the 1990s. In fact, those picks helped the Cowboys build a team that would go on to win 3 Super Bowls in 4 years. As for the Vikings, they never got close to a Super Bowl with Walker. In hindsight, the trade looks like one of the most lopsided deals in NFL history. The Vikings gave up the farm for a player who didn't meet expectations, while the Cowboys used the trade as the foundation for a dynasty. It's no wonder this trade is often referred to as the Great Train Robbery. Dallas absolutely fleeced Minnesota. The Vikings gambled big, but they ended up with nothing but regret, while the Cowboys turned their haul of draft picks into one of the greatest runs in NFL history. For Vikings fans, the Herschel Walker trade will forever be remembered as the deal that could have brought them Super Bowl glory, but instead, it set the Cowboys up for a dynasty. Let's talk about the Khalil Mack trade, an unforgettable move that left Oakland Raiders fans scratching their heads. In 2018, the Raiders made the controversial decision to trade their all-pro pass rusher to the Chicago Bears in exchange for 2 first-round picks, along with a few other draft selections. The move was seen as a gamble by Oakland, who were effectively giving up one of the best defensive players in the NFL. Mack had been a force of nature during his time in Oakland. Known for his relentless pursuit of quarterbacks and his ability to disrupt offenses, he had already earned Defensive Player of the Year honors and multiple Pro Bowl selections. When the Raiders traded him, many wondered why they would let go of a generational talent who was still in his prime. The answer? The Raiders were in rebuilding mode and didn't want to commit to the massive contract Mack was seeking. So, instead of locking down their star defender, they opted for draft capital and a fresh start. On the other side of the deal, the Chicago Bears couldn't believe their luck. They immediately signed Mack to a record-breaking contract and watched as he transformed their defense overnight. In his very first season with Chicago, Mack was a game-changer, helping the Bears to a 12-4 record and a playoff appearance. His impact was felt every week, whether he was sacking quarterbacks, forcing fumbles, or just creating havoc in the backfield. Mack instantly became the face of the Bears' defense, and it was clear that Chicago had landed a superstar. Meanwhile, the Raiders struggled to replace the production they lost with Mack's departure. The draft picks they acquired in the trade didn't yield the immediate results they had hoped for, and Oakland's defense looked toothless without their elite pass rusher. The decision to trade Mack left a gaping hole on the Raiders' roster, and they spent years trying to recover from the loss. Looking back, it's clear that the Bears got the better end of this deal. They acquired a game-changing player who helped elevate their defense to one of the best in the league, while the Raiders were left with draft picks that didn't come close to matching Mack's impact. As the saying goes, sometimes it's better to keep the monster you already have. For the Raiders, trading Mack was a decision they'll likely regret for a long time. Let's talk about one of the biggest draft busts in NFL history, Ryan Leaf. In 1998, the San Diego Chargers were convinced that Leaf was their quarterback of the future. To secure him, they traded several draft picks, including a first-rounder, to move up and select him second overall, right behind Peyton Manning. At the time, it wasn't crazy to think that Leaf could go on to have a similar career to Manning. In fact, many experts debated whether Leaf or Manning would be the better pick. Spoiler alert, it wasn't close. While Peyton Manning went on to become one of the greatest quarterbacks in NFL history, Ryan Leaf became the poster child for draft day disasters. His time with the Chargers was an unmitigated disaster. Almost immediately, it became clear that Leaf lacked not only the skills but also the maturity to succeed in the NFL. His decision-making on the field was erratic, leading to countless turnovers, while his attitude off the field was even worse. He clashed with teammates, coaches, and the media, which only amplified the pressure on him. In his rookie season, Leaf threw 15 interceptions compared to just 2 touchdowns, and his completion percentage was an abysmal 45%. Things didn't get better from there. Injuries and poor performances defined the rest of his short career, and by 2001, the Chargers had moved on, cutting ties with Leaf after just 3 seasons. Meanwhile, Peyton Manning was thriving in Indianapolis, setting records and eventually leading the Colts to 2 Super Bowl appearances, winning 1. The contrast between the two quarterbacks couldn't have been starker. The Chargers, who had invested so much to draft Leaf, were left reeling from one of the most painful mistakes in franchise history. Looking back, it's almost shocking how bad the Leaf pick turned out. He was supposed to lead the Chargers for the next 15 years, but instead, he delivered just 2 years of chaos and frustration. His career became a cautionary tale for NFL teams, showing that sometimes the biggest risk isn't just about talent, but about character and readiness for the pressure of the league. As they say, when you choose wrong, you really choose wrong. And in the case of Ryan Leaf, the Chargers couldn't have chosen more wrong if they tried. Let's wrap things up with a trade that the Houston Oilers would probably rather forget the time they gave up Steve Largent for a mere 8th-round pick. Yes, you read that right. In 1976, the Oilers decided that Largent, a promising wide receiver fresh out of college, wasn't quite what they were looking for. So, they traded him to the Seattle Seahawks for next to nothing. And what did the Seahawks get in return? Oh, just one of the greatest wide receivers to ever play the game. Largent had been a fourth-round pick in the 1976 draft, but for some reason, the Oilers weren't sold on his potential. Seattle, however, saw something special in him, and they made the trade that would help define their franchise for years to come. From the moment Largent stepped on the field in Seattle, it was clear that the Oilers had made a huge mistake. Largent went on to have a legendary career with the Seahawks. He was known for his precise route running, soft hands, and ability to make clutch catches in critical moments. Over his 14-year career, Largent set multiple NFL records, including most career receptions, receiving yards, and touchdown catches at the time of his retirement. He became the face of the Seahawks franchise and was inducted into the Pro Football Hall of Fame in 1995. Meanwhile, the Oilers were left wondering what could have been. The 8th-round pick they received in exchange for Largent didn't amount to much, and they had to watch from afar as Largent became a superstar in Seattle. It's one of those trades that stings even more as time goes on, especially considering how little Houston got in return for a player who became one of the best wide receivers in NFL history. Looking back, it's hard to believe the Oilers gave up so easily on a future Hall of Famer. Largent's legacy in Seattle is undeniable, and the fact that the Oilers traded him away for next to nothing remains one of the most baffling moves in NFL history. As they say, hindsight is 20/20, but in this case, Houston really missed the mark. Trading away a future Hall of Famer for essentially nothing? That's a tough pill to swallow, especially when you consider the legacy Steve Largent left behind in Seattle. And there you have it, the 20 worst trades in NFL history, showing just how much one bad decision can change the course of a franchise. Each of these trades broke the hearts of fans, but they also reminded us how unpredictable the sport can be. Some teams lost their shot at glory, while others used these deals to build dynasties. If you enjoyed revisiting these infamous trades, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more NFL stories like this.